The smell hit before anyone saw them. It came rolling out of the darkness beyond the wire, thick and sour, heavy enough that it felt like it coated the inside of the lungs. Corporal Ethan Walker, of the United States Marine Corps, had smelled death before. Burned vehicles, bodies left too long in the sun, compounds after strikes. This was different. Sharper. Wrong in a way his brain couldn't process. His breathing stopped on instinct, his grip tightened on his rifle, and his eyes locked onto the black horizon outside Forward Operating Base Ashford in Kandahar Province, winter 2009. Something died out there, someone muttered. Then the smell got stronger. 4 figures emerged from the darkness, walking straight toward the checkpoint. Not stumbling, not cautious, calm, controlled. Walker lifted his night vision and felt his stomach tighten. They were armed, geared, moving like professionals. But something about them didn't match. The way they looked didn't line up with the way they carried themselves. As they stepped into clearer view, the details made it worse. Their uniforms were completely obscured under layers of dirt, dried mud, and dark stains that had fused into the fabric. Their gear looked aged, almost decayed. Their faces were streaked with uneven grime, not standard camouflage, but something irregular, distorted. One Marine beside Walker gagged. Another shifted back, instinctively raising his weapon before stopping when he noticed a barely visible British flag patch. Jesus. The lead man stepped forward. The smell hit full force now, close enough to feel physical. He extended his hand casually, like this was routine. "Sergeant Daniel Harker, Special Air Service," he said calmly. "Sorry about the smell. We've been out a while." Walker hesitated, then shook his hand. The texture alone was enough to make his jaw tighten. Grit, oil, something organic. He forced himself to stay neutral. "How long is a while?" "Just over 3 weeks," Harker said. Lost track after the second. 3 weeks. Walker's mind stalled on that. 3 weeks outside the wire without rotation, without normal support, without even basic hygiene. And they looked like this. But they didn't move like men falling apart. They were steady, focused, in control. "We're here for extraction," Harker added. "High-value target secured. Your command's expecting us." Walker nodded and motioned toward the command post. As the SAS team passed through the checkpoint, every Marine reacted the same way. Small steps back, hands rising toward faces, expressions shifting from confusion to disgust. One of the younger guys actually asked if they were carrying casualties. The British operators laughed quietly, like they'd heard it before. Inside, the smell spread fast, filling the tent in seconds. Conversation shortened. Movement stiffened. Officers tried to stay composed, but no one ignored it. It lingered, heavy and unavoidable. Later, in the chow hall, the Marines tried to process it. "Did you get close?" one asked Walker. "Yeah." "And?" Walker shook his head slightly. "They don't smell like people. Not like us." Another Marine leaned forward. "How do you stay out there like that?" Walker paused. "That's not the part that bothers me. It's that they're still sharp. Nothing about them says they're breaking." That contradiction stuck. Everything about their appearance suggested collapse, neglect, degradation, something gone wrong. But the way they moved, spoke, and carried themselves said the opposite. They weren't losing control. They were operating at a level that didn't match what they looked like. What no one at FOB Ashford understood was that this wasn't accidental. It wasn't something that had happened to them. It was something they had done on purpose. Because in certain environments, being detected doesn't start with sight or sound. It starts with scent. Human beings notice what doesn't belong. Not consciously at first, but instinctively. A smell that's out of place, something unfamiliar carried on the wind. For fighters who have spent their entire lives in one environment, eating the same food, living under the same conditions, those differences stand out immediately. Western soldiers always smelled different diet, processed food, chemicals from hygiene products, treated fabrics. Every part of their routine left traces. In places like southern Afghanistan, those traces didn't blend in. They marked you. Some units tried to mask it. The SAS removed it. Before certain operations, preparation didn't stop at weapons and planning. It extended to the body itself. Days before deployment, everything Western was cut out completely. No packaged rations, no familiar food. Only what locals ate: rice, flatbread, dried fruit, strong tea, heavily spiced meals. Food that changed the body's chemistry, altering sweat and breath in ways that couldn't be faked externally. Hygiene products were eliminated next. No soap, no deodorant, no toothpaste. Nothing that left behind artificial residue. The body was allowed to rebalance, building a natural layer that matched the environment instead of standing out against it. Clothing followed the same principle. Uniforms weren't cleaned. They were conditioned. Soaked in local water, embedded with dust, exposed to smoke from fires common in the area. Gear was treated the same way. Anything with a distinct foreign smell was altered or removed. The goal wasn't to look local, it was to stop smelling foreign. Because smell travels differently than sound or sight. It moves with the wind, around obstacles, through darkness. It reaches places eyes can't see and ears can't hear. And for people who rely on instinct as much as training, it's often the first warning that something isn't right. By the time these teams stepped into the field, they had stripped away every obvious marker of who they were. What remained didn't resemble professional soldiers in the traditional sense. It looked like something closer to neglect, to breakdown, to something gone wrong. But it worked. Men who smelled like processed food and chemical soap could be detected long before they were seen. Men who carried no foreign scent could move closer, stay longer, observe without triggering that initial alarm. That was the difference. Not technology, not firepower. Presence without detection. By the end of the process, the operators didn't just blend visually, they blended biologically. To anyone downwind, there was nothing unusual to notice. No signal to interpret, no reason to react, and that was enough to get them closer than anyone else. Closer than most soldiers would ever risk. Closer than their enemies believed was possible. By the 5th day, the change was complete. The smell wasn't just on their clothes anymore. It came from their skin, their breath, their gear. It followed them constantly, thick and unavoidable. For most men, that would have been a breaking point. For them, it was confirmation. They inserted just before dusk into a valley west of Lashkar Gah, an area where coalition forces rarely operated without heavy support. Taliban fighters controlled the ground, moving freely between compounds and villages. Conventional units could only enter with vehicles, air cover, and constant communication. And even then, they were usually detected long before arrival. A 4-man team had none of that. They moved light and silent. No unnecessary gear, no wasted motion. Every step controlled. They weren't trying to stay far away. They were trying to get close. The first night, they established an observation point overlooking a cluster of compounds connected by narrow dirt paths. From a distance, it looked empty, but that meant nothing. Activity in places like this stayed behind walls. They waited. On the second night, patterns began to form. Movement between buildings. A guard shifting position near an entrance. Occasional voices carried by the wind. The team watched, recorded, and memorized. They were less than 100 meters away, close enough that any mistake should have exposed them instantly. But nothing happened. The guard didn't react. No one stepped outside. No alarm. At one point, the wind shifted, carrying their scent toward the compound. One of the operators froze, waiting for a response. There wasn't one. The guard remained still, unaware that armed men were lying in the dark within rifle range. For most units, that distance would have been impossible. For them, it was normal. By the third night, they moved closer. They shifted positions under cover of darkness, reducing the distance further. 50 meters, sometimes less. They passed near structures where voices could be heard clearly, men talking, laughing, unaware of anything outside their walls. No dogs barked, no lights turned on. Nothing reacted. They weren't invisible. They just didn't trigger anything. On the fourth night, they followed movement. 2 fighters left the compound after midnight, heading toward another village along a narrow path. The team shadowed them at a controlled distance, maintaining visual contact without closing too fast. Less than 200 meters. Close enough to lose them if they made a mistake. Close enough that, under normal conditions, they would have been detected. But the fighters never turned. There was no reason to. Nothing in the air behind them suggested danger. No unfamiliar scent. No signal that something didn't belong. Just the same environment they had always known. The team tracked them for hours, mapping routes and identifying secondary locations. This wasn't distant surveillance. It was direct observation inside enemy-controlled space. That was the difference. Not better optics, not better weapons. Closer access. By the 6th day, they had enough. Patterns, names, locations, a clear picture of how the network operated. The decision came fast. No airstrike. Too much risk of losing valuable information. No large assault. That would alert everyone nearby. It had to be controlled. They moved before dawn. The approach was silent, every step measured. They already knew the layout, where the guards stood, how long it took for someone to cross the compound, where the entrances were. They closed the final distance without resistance. The first guard reacted too late. The second didn't react at all. The operation lasted minutes. Targets were engaged with controlled force. Documents and devices were collected. One individual was secured alive. No unnecessary noise. No delay. Then they were gone. They withdrew the same way they came, quietly, without leaving a clear trace. By the time others arrived, there was nothing to follow. No direction, no obvious path, just the aftermath. What came next wasn't what most expected. Intercepted communications later showed confusion more than anything else. Fighters described hearing nothing until it was over. Some believed the attackers had been inside the compound the entire time. Others thought they had appeared out of nowhere. What stood out wasn't the details. It was the tone. They weren't describing a normal attack. They were trying to explain something that didn't fit. Men who moved without warning, who appeared where no one had been seen, who got close without triggering any reaction. Because every instinct had failed them. They hadn't seen anything wrong, they hadn't heard anything wrong, and more importantly, they hadn't smelled anything wrong. The first real signal came only when it was too late. For fighters who depended on those signals, that wasn't just a tactical problem. It created uncertainty. And uncertainty in that environment spread fast. By the time the team moved toward extraction, they had been in the field for over 3 weeks. The physical toll was there: fatigue, strain, minor injuries, but it didn't affect how they operated. They were still controlled, still focused, still effective. When they returned to a coalition base, the reaction was immediate: distance, discomfort, the same instinctive response from anyone who got close enough. But by then, it didn't matter. The mission was complete. The advantage that made it possible wasn't visible. It couldn't be seen in equipment or measured in firepower. It existed in something most soldiers never considered a factor. And once you understood it, distance stopped being safety. It became a limitation. Long before Afghanistan, before deserts and compounds and night raids, the problem had already been discovered, and it had nothing to do with modern warfare. It started in the jungle. Malaya, early 1950s. British forces were fighting a communist insurgency in terrain so dense it swallowed sound, distorted distance, and erased visibility beyond a few meters. On paper, it should have favored trained soldiers. Thick vegetation, limited sightlines, perfect conditions for stealth. But it didn't work that way. Patrols kept getting detected without explanation. No gunfire, no snapped branches, no visual contact, yet ambushes came anyway, precise, timed, as if the insurgents knew exactly where they were before they even arrived. At first, it didn't make sense. Then patterns started to emerge. The guerrillas weren't reacting to what they saw. They were reacting to what didn't belong. British soldiers carried their environment with them. Tinned rations, processed food, soap, tobacco, treated uniforms, everything about them was foreign. Their bodies processed different substances, producing scents that didn't exist in the jungle. Chemicals, preservatives, residues that lingered on skin and fabric. In a place where survival depended on noticing small changes, that was enough. The jungle wasn't just something you moved through. It was something you had to match. The first men to understand this weren't following orders. They were adapting because they had no choice. Long-range patrols operating deeper than usual began making small changes. They stopped using soap, cut out rations when possible, ate what locals ate, rice, fish, whatever could be sourced nearby. At first, it was about practicality. Then it became something else. After days of living that way, something shifted. Their bodies changed. Sweat smelled different. Breath changed. Even their gear began to carry the same scent as the environment around them. And the difference showed immediately. They got closer before being noticed. Sometimes they weren't noticed at all. Positions that had been impossible to approach suddenly became accessible. Observation posts could be set within distances that should have been suicidal. Movement through contested areas became quieter, not in sound, but in presence. They weren't invisible. They just didn't stand out anymore. When the Special Air Service began formalizing its methods, these lessons weren't ignored. They were kept, refined, and passed on. Not as theory, but as something proven under pressure. By the time operations shifted to Borneo in the 1960s, The approach was no longer improvised. It was deliberate. Before entering hostile territory, teams would begin preparation days in advance. Diet changed first. No external food, only what existed in the area of operations. Rice, fish paste, fermented products strong enough to alter the body at a chemical level. Hygiene was removed completely. No soap, no toothpaste, nothing artificial. The body was left to adapt, to rebuild a natural balance that matched the environment instead of fighting against it. Clothing and equipment followed the same principle. Nothing was cleaned in the traditional sense. Fabric absorbed moisture, soil, organic matter. Gear was left untreated, allowed to carry the same signatures as the terrain itself. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't clean, but it worked. Indonesian fighters moving through the same terrain couldn't rely on scent to detect them. There was no clear difference between the operators and the environment they were moving through. The early warning system, one of the most basic human instincts, was neutralized. That changed everything. Patrols could move closer, observe longer, and withdraw without triggering a response. Not because they were better armed, but because they removed the signal that gave them away. By the 1970s, the concept had moved again, this time to the deserts of Oman. The environment was different, but the principle stayed the same. Here the problem wasn't dense vegetation. It was exposure, open terrain, long sight lines, limited cover. But even in those conditions, scent still mattered. Local fighters lived on specific diets, used minimal resources, and carried the smell of their environment with them. Dust, animals, smoke. Foreign soldiers didn't. They stood out immediately. The adaptation shifted with the terrain. Food changed to match local sources: dates, flatbread, goat meat, strong coffee. Hygiene was reduced even further due to limited water. Dust and sand became part of the process, coating skin and fabric until nothing looked or smelled out of place. Again, the effect was the same. Detection became harder. Not impossible, but delayed. And in combat, delay was often enough. By the time modern operations began in places like Afghanistan, this wasn't an experiment anymore. It wasn't something improvised in the field. It was understood. Not written openly, not explained to conventional forces, but embedded in the way certain units prepared for specific missions. Because the logic didn't change, humans are wired to notice difference. In environments where people have lived for generations under the same conditions, those differences become obvious in ways outsiders underestimate. Food, hygiene, materials, all of it creates a pattern. Anything outside that pattern becomes a signal. Most forces tried to hide visually. Camouflage patterns, movement discipline, night operations, but visual concealment only works when someone is looking. Scent doesn't depend on that, it travels without permission. Around obstacles, through darkness, across distance. It reaches people before they ever see what's coming. And once they notice it, the reaction is automatic. Something is wrong, that's all it takes. The SAS approach removed that moment entirely. No signal, no reaction, no early warning. It didn't make them invisible. It didn't guarantee success. But it removed one of the most reliable ways humans detect danger. And that shifted the balance. Because once that layer was gone, everything else became easier. Movement, observation, approach, even withdrawal. The enemy wasn't blind. They were just missing the first clue. And without that, every other sense reacted too late. That's why the method stayed. Through different wars, different terrains, different decades, it adapted, but it never disappeared. Not because it was comfortable or acceptable by conventional standards, but because it solved a problem most soldiers didn't even realize existed. By the time those 4 men walked into a Marine base in Afghanistan decades later, covered in grime and carrying a smell that triggered instinctive disgust, they weren't the result of neglect. They were the result of refinement. Years of trial, error, and adaptation compressed into a method that most people would reject immediately if it were explained to them, because it required crossing a line, letting go of the idea of what a soldier should look like, accepting that effectiveness sometimes meant becoming something that didn't resemble professionalism at all. And for the men who used it, that trade was already decided. By the time they came back, the war felt distant to everyone else on base, but it was still on them. You could tell before you even saw them. The smell hit first. It moved ahead of them through the airfield at Camp Bastion, cutting through everything. Fuel, dust, sweat, food. Marines and soldiers turned instinctively, scanning for the source, expecting something dead, something rotting nearby. Then they saw them. 4 men walking across the tarmac like nothing was wrong. Conversation stopped. People shifted aside without thinking. Some covered their faces, others just stared. The reaction was always the same. Confusion first, then discomfort, then something closer to rejection. They didn't look like soldiers who had just completed a mission. They looked like they had survived something they shouldn't have. Their uniforms had lost all original color, layered with dirt and grime that had become permanent. Their skin carried the same texture, oil, dust, residue that didn't wash off easily. Even their gear looked older, like it had been dragged through the ground and left there. But their movement didn't match any of it. They were steady, controlled, focused, still operating. Inside the debriefing room, the effect was immediate. Officers tried to maintain professionalism, but it didn't hold for long. The smell filled the space, heavy and unavoidable. One American officer shifted in his chair, clearly struggling to ignore it. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath. The briefing itself was efficient. No wasted words. Locations, movements, confirmations. Everything delivered clearly, without exaggeration. Intelligence that had taken weeks to collect, presented in minutes. But attention kept drifting, not because of what was being said, because of what was sitting across the table. Afterward, the complaint came. It was formal, written, passed up through the chain. The language stayed controlled, but the meaning was clear. Concerns about hygiene, about contamination, about professionalism, questions about whether soldiers in that condition should even be allowed inside shared facilities. It wasn't anger, it was misunderstanding. To the officer who wrote it, what he saw looked like failure, a breakdown of standards, a loss of discipline. Everything military structure was designed to prevent. He couldn't see the process behind it, couldn't understand that the condition he found unacceptable was intentional and necessary. The response from the British side was simple. No changes. The method wasn't up for discussion. It wasn't something to be adjusted for comfort or appearance. It existed because it worked, and that was the only standard that mattered. The tension never fully went away. Conventional forces valued consistency, clean uniforms, clear structure, visible discipline. something that could be measured and maintained across large units. What they were looking at didn't fit any of that. It couldn't be standardized. It couldn't be explained easily, and it definitely couldn't be made comfortable. But the results were there. Lower casualty rates in areas where losses should have been higher. Access to locations others couldn't reach without support. Intelligence gathered from distances most units wouldn't risk approaching, not because of better equipment, because of proximity. And proximity came from not being detected. The smell that triggered disgust in friendly forces was the same thing that removed early warning from the enemy. That was the trade. And it came with a cost. Physical, at first. Weeks without proper hygiene took a toll. Skin conditions, infections, constant irritation that never fully went away during deployment. Small issues that built over time, ignored because the mission came first. Dental problems followed. Diet changes, lack of normal care, stress on the body that didn't show immediately, but accumulated across multiple operations. Then the longer effects. Some operators found it harder to return to normal routines than expected. Not physically, mentally. Clean environments felt unnatural. The absence of constant strain felt wrong. Even something as simple as regular hygiene created a sense of discomfort that didn't make logical sense. Because for weeks at a time, they had conditioned themselves to operate in the opposite state, to function at a high level while stripped of everything that usually defined normal life. That didn't switch off instantly. One former operator described it simply years later. The hardest part wasn't the field, he said. It was coming back and acting like that version of you didn't exist. Because it did. And it had been necessary. Back at the base, most people never understood that. They remembered the smell. They remembered the way those men looked walking in from the dark, like something that didn't belong among normal soldiers. They remembered the instinctive reaction, the need to step back, to create distance. What they didn't see was what that condition represented. Weeks inside hostile territory without being detected. Movement through areas that should have been impossible to access. Operations completed without triggering the signals every human relies on to recognize danger. They saw the result, not the reason. And that was the part that stayed with people like Walker long after deployment ended. At the time, it didn't make sense. It just felt wrong. Later, with distance, it became clear. Professionalism wasn't always what it looked like. It wasn't always clean or structured or easy to recognize. Sometimes it meant doing things that went completely against expectation, against comfort, against instinct, because the environment demanded it. Years after leaving the Marines, Walker would still tell that story, not as something shocking, but as something important. 4 men walking out of the dark, carrying a smell strong enough to stop conversation, looking like they had lost control, but operating with complete precision. And he would always end it the same way. If he ever had to rely on someone in a place where detection meant death, where being seen or heard or even sensed could end everything, he wouldn't choose the cleanest or the most polished. He'd choose the ones who understood what mattered, the ones willing to go further than what looked acceptable. Because in that kind of environment, appearance didn't keep you alive. Comfort didn't keep you alive. Even training by itself wasn't enough. What mattered was removing every possible signal that could give you away, even the ones most people never think about, especially those. The smell wasn't a failure. It wasn't a side effect. It was a tool, unpleasant, extreme, impossible to ignore, but effective. And in the end, that was the only thing that counted. Because in places where survival depends on staying undetected, the smallest detail can become the difference. And sometimes that difference isn't visible. Sometimes it's something you carry with you, something that warns everyone else to stay away, while letting you get close enough to finish the mission.